In the physical gallery space, the object presents itself with heavy industrial weight. We are looking at a series of 13 solid acrylic plates, each 10 millimeters thick, scarred by deep laser burns that form a dense, chaotic web of intersecting lines. This installation was produced by Mexican artist and researcher Jaime between 2014 and 2024. It serves as a focal point in his career retrospective, Naturfichal, exhibited at the Centro de Cultura Digital in Mexico City. Looking at this rigid, geometric static, you are confronted with a paradox of classification. Despite the total absence of a face, a body, or any recognizable human geometry, the institution and the artist officially classify this mass of abstract noise as a self-portrait. The classification holds because the lines are not arbitrary. Every coordinate, every jagged turn, and every cluster of burns is generated entirely by highly precise biometric data extracted directly from the artist's own body. Historically, the self-portrait functions as a tool for validation, a way to solidify the creator's ego and guarantee their permanence in the material world. Lobato engineers a system that does the exact opposite. He utilizes biometric measurement to systematically annihilate his own visual identity. In its standard application, eye-tracking hardware is an instrument of extraction and surveillance. Whether used in clinical neuromarketing or military targeting, biometric technology exists to measure attention, police boundaries, and permanently lock down human identity into a verifiable dataset. Lobato subverts this utility completely, a redirect hinted at by the artwork's title, Atma. This is a Sanskrit term central to Hindu philosophy, referring to the ultimate, eternal, and formless soul, the pure consciousness that exists beneath the temporary illusions of the body and mind. In the non-dualist tradition of Advaita Vedanta, a strict ontological rule applies to this concept. The Atman is the ultimate observer. Because it is the entity doing the looking, it is entirely formless and can never be observed as a physical object. By filtering this ancient metaphysical logic through modern hardware, Lobato engineers a cybernetic feedback loop that forces a technological prosthesis to look at its own looking. The resulting output is an intentional epistemological collapse, generating physical proof that the true self is entirely unobservable. The protocol that creates this collapse begins with a simple act of observation. Lobato positions himself in front of a traditional photographic portrait of his own face, staring at it for 5 uninterrupted minutes while the eye tracker records him. To understand the data being collected, we have to look at the physiological reality of human vision. The eye does not take in light smoothly like a panning camera lens. It constructs a scene through a fragmented, highly erratic mechanical process. This diagram illustrates exactly how that mechanism operates. The eye darts across the visual field in rapid, involuntary ballistic jumps known as saccades. Between these violent movements, the eye pauses to absorb information, creating moments of intense focus called fixations, usually clustering around semantic anchors like the eyes or mouth. As the hardware records Lobato's observation, it strips away the photograph entirely. It translates the invisible biological labor of his optic nerve into a tangible, two-dimensional digital vector map. In the context of art theory, specifically Rosalind Krauss's writings on the index, this digital file operates exactly like a footprint in mud. It is not a drawing or a subjective representation of a face. It is an indexical trace, a direct physical impression left behind by the artist's cognitive attention. Under this algorithmic paradigm, the human gaze is stripped of its passive role. Observation becomes an active, material force, one capable of leaving a permanent, measurable scar. The process, however, does not end with one drawing. Lobato takes the resulting indexical trace, prints it, and sits down to look directly at it. He tracks his gaze as he observes his own observation, generating a second layer of data. In cybernetics and engineering, this architecture is defined as a positive feedback loop. It occurs when the output of a system is fed directly back into its own input, forcing the cycle to repeat and react to itself. The physical consequence of any positive feedback loop is predictable. Whether in acoustics or optics, feeding a signal back into itself inherently breeds instability, amplifying raw noise with every single cycle until the original signal is buried. This cyclical destruction aligns tightly with Jack Burnham's 1968 theory of systems aesthetics, a text critical to understanding post-war procedural art. Burnham argued that the true location of an artwork is not inside an isolated solid object. Rather, the art exists in the invisible, dynamic exchange of information, energy, and organization between the human and the machine. By treating the artist's face as mere input data, the destruction of the figurative ego, what Hindu philosophy terms the ahankara, is not an artistic accident. It is a mathematical inevitability, guaranteed by the thermodynamic constraints of the cybernetic loop. Lobato's method sits within a specific historical genealogy of media artists, using closed-circuit loops to intentionally disorient the viewer and fracture the unified psychoanalytic ego. We see the archetype for this in Namjoon Taik's 1974 installation, TV Buddha. Paik established the blueprint for merging spiritual self-contemplation with electronic retrofeedback, locking a statue in an infinite loop of observing its own mediated image. Simultaneously, the eye tracker itself brings a distinct technological lineage. Rooted in early clinical psychology and behavioral extraction, the hardware was designed entirely around a power dynamic where the institution measures the subject. Contemporary artists like Raphael Lozano Hemmer often utilize this biometric extraction, gathering massive datasets to build monumental portraits that affirm human presence. Lobato initiates a critical divergence. While the historical trajectory of surveillance technology seeks to archive, identify, and affirm, Lobato weaponizes the hardware's exact precision to perform a radical act of anti-biometry, using the machine to erase his own record. Looking at the 13th and final plate of the series, the total lack of referential visual information brings us back to the title, Atma, and the philosophical intent driving the machine. The mechanics of the artwork find their exact theoretical parallel in a 14th century Sanskrit text called the Drig Drishya Viveka, which translates to the discernment between the seer and the seen. The text establishes a primary epistemological rule. The ultimate witness, the true self, can never be perceived as a contingent empirical object. The logic is absolute. Just as a sword cannot cut its own blade and fire cannot burn itself, the seer cannot be seen. Lobato applies this ancient logic to his modern machine setup. By forcing an objective hardware system to track the subjective biological act of looking at one's own looking, he demands an optical impossibility. The resulting visual static is not a software failure. It operates as apophatic proof, a visual demonstration through negative space and error that the true self is formless and violently resists empirical measurement. This returns us to the physical manifestation of the work inside the Natraficial exhibition. Lobato chooses not to display this ephemeral data on a glowing screen, but to freeze it permanently into heavy 10mm acrylic. The material itself completes the metaphor. The transparent substrate of the acrylic evokes the invisible, formless nature of the Atman, while the opaque, violent laser burns serve as the scarred remnants of the ego fighting and failing to survive the loop. This friction anchors the central curatorial thesis of Naturicial. The biological optic nerve and the artificial machine vision are no longer separate entities. In this process, the wet biology of the eye and the cold logic of the algorithm act as seamless co-authors. In Atma, Jaime Lobato successfully builds a highly precise post-anthropocentric machine whose ultimate triumph is the total mathematical erasure of its human creator.